Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of Dispatches. I'm your host, Brady Kreitzer. Our guest today is Eric Sterner, and he'll be discussing the Ranger Samuel Brady and a little studied part of his frontier life. Eric, thanks for joining us again.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Eric, you've been on the show many times. Remind us about your background.
By education, I have a background in sort of political science and area studies, actually in Russian and Soviet studies, so that was really useful. I've worked in government and in the contractor world, primarily in national security and aerospace, two Congresses and committee and two committees in Congress, and then the DoD and NASA. Been writing about the American Revolution for 10 years with 3 books so far.
Eric, what made you want to write this article?
It's weird. I was actually looking at material on a 1780 Tory uprising all across the backcountry. I'd encountered bits and pieces of this before, and I hadn't really dug into it. I just sort of made a mental note to go look. So I was coming back to that, and I knew who Sam Brady was. And wow, this stuff is right here. And it just sort of sent me on a side path to, well, let's look at this story. Let's actually test some of the legend here because it was sort of right there. And it hadn't been told as near as I could tell. So that's what I decided to do.
Mm-hmm. So Samuel Brady's one of these interesting people. Everybody seems to know him in the American West, but very few people write things down about him. He kind of becomes a kind of a legendary figure for a lot of people, and certainly elusive for us. What could you tell us, Eric, about his background, his life?
He's born in 1756 or 1758, depending on who you read. I think it's 1756. That's what's on his gravestone. Um, he's born near Shippensburg, Pennsylvania, to John and Mary. John and Mary were both born in the colonies, Scotch-Irish descent. John had served in the French and Indian War, risen to the rank of captain in the militia. Sam is the oldest of their children. They go on, I think, to have 12. Well, he has 12 brothers and sisters. They have 13 kids. Three of those brothers and sisters don't survive childhood. Um, and in 1775, Pennsylvania is raising rifle companies to go to Boston. And Samuel and his father, John, joined one. And they ended up in a rifle company outside Boston.
So when we pick up Brady here around the American Revolution, Fort Pitt is the western headquarters of the Continental Army. Eric, what could you tell us about his role there? He kind of has a non-traditional role at Fort Pitt. What's his primary job there?
It's kind of interesting how he works over there. He ends up there. You read the popular histories or the boys' histories of Sam Brady, which is where a lot of our information or legend comes from. He fights everywhere in the East, right up through 1778, 79. He moves to the 8th Pennsylvania, which is stationed at Fort Pitt, and that brings him to Fort Pitt. When he gets there, he's a captain in the Continental Army, and he takes on the role of a ranger. Essentially, what he's going to do is he's going to patrol back trails, look for signs of Indian raiding parties. He's going to pursue Indian parties that have hit the frontier, and he's going to be out there looking for incoming. And he's going to do some spying. This is sort of what brings us to this story, is he's off on a spying mission in Sandusky, which is up in northwestern Ohio.
Yeah, this is a very deeply personal article, Eric. I think when you study the people involved, you really kind of hone in on one family, one particular incident, the Stoops family. I think for a lot of viewers, their story, might reveal a new side maybe of the revolution they hadn't seen before. But tell us about the Stoops family and what happens to them.
James Stoops is a retired member of the 18th Regiment of Foot, which turns out to have a lot of connections to Pittsburgh. It was a British regiment, the Royal Irish. And when the regiment left the colonies, James stayed behind. I think he had 10 children, 6 of them are in Ireland, where the Royal Irish had been stationed for a long time. 4 of them are in Pittsburgh. I think I might have the numbers off, but that's in the article. One of them is 3 years old, young William, and they rent a farm, land owned by Edward Hand. We know him as a brigadier general. He'd been the surgeon at the 18th Regiment of Foot, and it's on Chartiers Creek. And at the end of May, beginning of June, 1780, a war party basically attacks their camp. In the middle of the night, they're woken up by pounding at the door, somebody trying to break in. This is a raiding party of 7 or 8 Native American warriors, probably Wyandotte, Delaware. And Jane, the wife, turns to James and says, make a run for it. So he gets out of the house in his shirt tails, couple handfuls of bullets and powder, and runs. And she's actually making a rational decision here. This is her advice, her decision, her position. When a cabin's attacked, you've sort of got three outcomes. You're either going to get captured, you're not going to be able to defend it with just a family and 3 people, or you're going to get burned alive inside of it. So if James escapes, he can go get help. He can warn his neighbors. And if Jane and William survive their initial capture, James can raise a party to go pursue the raiders and try and recover his wife and child. So she's making a rational decision in telling her husband to make a run for it. He does escape. The Indians do break into the cabin. It is on fire at this point, but it's a slow fire. Jane is hiding in the potato bin underneath the floorboards. And so the Indians come in and they see William, who's 3, and he's doing what 3-year-olds do when they're frightened. He's screaming at the top of his lungs. She's afraid they're going to kill him, so she comes out from hiding. And the Indians pretty quickly tie him, put him and her in separate horses. William is generally going to travel with the leader of the war party, and then they start heading back west towards villages in Upper Sandusky. There's going to be the Wyandotte and Delaware villages, which is part of the reason we think that's probably. So, middle of the night, cabin's on fire, family's attacked, don't have any options for defense for all practical purposes. 2 of them are taken prisoner. They're the most vulnerable people in the house, and they're being taken along a trail that's going to lead to the Sandusky River, again in northwestern Ohio.
Yeah, Eric, this is a really shocking story for those who aren't familiar. Was this sort of event common on the frontier, and what were the native peoples hoping to sort of achieve with these kind of attacks on families?
Well, this is how the war on the frontier was fought. Um, there's a lot of various reasons for the way the war is fought this way. They tend to be very small actions. They tend to attack vulnerable targets. Women, children, and civilians in their homes are the most vulnerable. These are isolated. Purposes are going to be sort of multifold. 1, you can kill your enemies. 2, you can loot your enemies, meaning booty. It's just a part of it. You think you're advancing sort of your tribe's goals, which is to drive the settlers, the Americans, across the Appalachians, which is the long-term goal for the Wyandotte since the French Indian War. And if you're inclined, you take your prisoners back to Detroit, and they might just get purchased by the British. And then they could later ransom them back to the Americans or their families for money. So it's sort of a tactical doctrine in terms of falling on lightly defended targets. It's a cultural way of demonstrating yourself as a warrior. There's a strategic interest here in making the frontier unsafe for families to move the settlers back across the Appalachians. It's a pretty standard strategy for Native Americans during this time.
Excellent. So, Eric, your article shows that when all hope seems lost, Samuel Brady suddenly appears on the scene, unexpectedly, probably by everybody. But could you tell us that story, how he encounters the Stoops family?
Well, the settlers on the frontier and the Continental officials at Fort Pitt, and this is at this point it's Colonel Daniel Broadhead who's in charge. He's not only commanding the 8th Pennsylvania, he knows exactly who Sam Brady is. He and George Rogers Clark want to coordinate a campaign against the Shawnee in southern Ohio and the Wyandot in Delaware and the other adversaries along the Sandusky River. To do that, he's got to reconnoiter the Sandusky River, right? So Broadhead sends Brady, who's one of his preferred scouts, and 7 or 8 men to Sandusky. And they're going to go head out to the river. They're going to come up on the Wyandot villages, and they're going to basically spy. They're going to watch and see what's happening. And this is, again, about May and June. So it's almost surprising that these raiding parties didn't meet each other sooner while to the west and the Indian. They arrive at the villages, or some of the villages in Sandusky. They watch some horse races. The horse races go on for 2 days, and it's quite a big deal. There's notes on who wins and why and which horse is better. And they do essentially something similar to what the Indians did. They grab 2 women who were isolated and out picking berries. These are Native American women, and they take them prisoner or captive, if you prefer, and they're going to take them back to Fort Pitt. So it turns out the Indian raiding party and Brady are using the same trail, which is pretty predictable since it's a direct route back and forth between Fort Pitt and the Sandusky. And uh, Brady and his men, they get rained on. Their food, so they don't have much ammunition. His party starts to splinter. 3 or 4 men decide they're going to go off and make a better way home. They may be headed to a different place other than Fort McIntosh or Fort Pitt. So he's down to 3 or 4 men, plus himself, 2 prisoners. One of those prisoners escapes. They get to eastern Ohio. They start following the Mahoning River, which is going to lead into Fort McIntosh. That's the closest fort. Brady goes ahead because they're out of food. He's got the last load of powder. He's going to look for a deer. As he's looking for this deer, here comes driving up the leader of the war party. He's got William Stoops tied behind him on this horse. And here's where things get a little confusing in terms of what you can track down in terms of the story. Brady's surprised that he gets the drop on the Indians, for lack of a better way to put it. He fires his last load of powder and he kills the Indian leader. He goes down and he takes William with him to the ground. Now, one version of the story that's contemporary says that basically Brady and all his men hid in the trees. And they ambushed these guys coming up. One of them is that Brady and his men, they were disguised as Native Americans. The raiding party or the war party fell for the disguise long enough for Brady to get closer and kill the Indian. And you're never quite sure which version to believe, which is why I walked through some of the differences in the versions in the article. Be that as it may, Brady drops the Indian, rushes the dead Indian to try and get his powder horn. If he hadn't seen William Stoops before, he's only 3, he's tied behind the Indian, he sees him now. He can't get the powder horn, and he can't get William free. The Indians fire at him back. He gets a misfire. The only one who fires a shot, and it's a flash in the pan. Basically, ignites the powder in the pan and doesn't explode. So at that point, Samuel Brady, he's yelling, his men are yelling. The Indians start to scatter or retreat. He makes a beeline for Jane Stoops, gets her free, and then he's looking to get away from the trail with her. And again, we get the 2 versions of the story. Is Brady with his men or is Brady on his own at this point? And at this point, it looks like he was still with his men. They may have spread out, taken a little bit of a put some more distance between themselves and the raiding. They take the opportunity while everything's in confusion, basically to escape, and they get across the Mahoning River. At this point, Brady's other prisoner, she manages to escape, and then they have to get themselves back to Fort McIntosh. So that's the story in a nutshell.
Eric, you've written a number of articles and books on this topic. Maybe we could use now to talk shop a little bit. Um, what are some of the challenges about studying a person like Samuel Brady for a historian?
He's a lot of the if you go looking up by if you go look for biographies of Brady and a lot of these frontier folks, you find them written down in the 1800s, and they tend to be in the mid 19th century, so 1850s, 1860s. Uh, the historians working at this point are recording local tales, tradition. So this is not quite oral history, but it's close, and that we're just writing down what everybody knows, right? But the problem, when we all know this, is that as you tell a tale and retell a tale and retell a tale, it changes. It's like a game of telephone, right? So by the time you get to the 1860s, everybody who's involved is gone, and you're just repeating or rewriting down what you think the story is. Now, the writers working in the 19th century, they wanted to sell books. So the more exciting, the better. Some of them had a different purpose, and it was to, quote, recapture the frontier spirit. And one of the authors I think I cited in a biography of Brady actually says that's his purpose. He wants to inspire young men in the traditions of courage and in the characteristics of bravery and so on and so on and so on. So Brady is his mechanism to do that. He's not a historian. He's a writer. So if you start there, which is where we all usually end up starting because that's what exists, you're starting with fiction. The thing is, where there's smoke, there's fire, and there's enough here. Well, people chose to remember this person and tell these stories for a reason. You know, it wasn't John Smith, it was Sam Brady. So you got to go look for the fire. What I did with this piece, and I was fortunate to find it, was in a collection of stories recorded by Lyman Draper in the 1800s, early 1800s. He went and his team he used assistants all over the place, and they recorded interviews with people, and they managed to get Andrew Fowler, who was a lieutenant in the 18th Royal Irish and happened to live in Pittsburgh. Fowler heard the story of the Stoops family from James Stoops, and he promptly reported it to Edward Hand. So that story gets recorded that way, very close to the time it occurs. Brady, of course, survived the war. He gets back to his base, or Fort McIntosh, and eventually at Fort Pitt. He's got to report into Brownhead in terms of what he's seen. So Brownhead makes notes at that time. So we've got those sources. There's another man named James Spratt, who was a scout, worked for Brady later in Brady's life during the French and Indian War of the Northwest Territory. And Spratt hears some of these things we think, or I would think, from Brady's own mouth. But he was raised in the area and certainly knew what the oral tradition was in the late 1700s. So pretty close to the time of the occurred. And the last one, most interesting one, is Hugh Brady. Hugh Brady was Sam's brother. He grew up to be a general in the Continental Army, fought the War of 1812, Thames and everything. So we've got sources that are all contemporary that knew Brady personally, reporting bits and pieces of this story at the time. Now, there's differences in their versions. The one I left out was Nancy Stoops, who was Jane Stoops' daughter-in-law and married William. She tells the story as she related it, or her mother-in-law remembered it. So you get some actual period documentation here, which is often missing when you look at guys like Sam Brady or the Kenton, the Zanes, and so on. So that's why this one captured my attention.
Yeah, Eric, based on everything you've just explained, I guess how would I ask this? Do you think we have an accurate picture of Brady today? So much was written by fiction writers for younger audiences. There's challenges you don't often get in other parts of this field. Do you think we have a pretty good sense of who he was?
I we can verify some specific events in his life. The death of his father, which is pretty well documented at the hands of the Native American raiding party. We can document some of the events that he was involved in, the rescue of the Stoops family. He was involved in one mission where he rescued children, leading a pursuit party and rescued the Henry children. These were prisoners, these were kids taken as prisoners. I think there's it's actually well documented. Brady's been, yeah, yeah. Curiously, there's something called Brady's Leap in Kent, Ohio. Across the
Yeah, we
You
want to
actually
stress
see the
allegedly on that one. It's
well,
quite a jump. It's quite a jump.
I grew up in Ohio, so he made it.
Yeah.
Right? Just taking his
I mean,
God,
if
taking
anyone's
his
gonna do it, it's
gospel,
him, I think.
taking his gospel. The guy was Superman.
Yeah, I'm
Uh,
certainly not gonna try.
don't want to piss off the people in Kent. Um, there's another version of that story where he jumped across Slippery Rock Creek in Pennsylvania,
Yeah.
but that one sort of faded out because there's a park. Um, that one's harder to document. So when it comes to a sense of Brady, some of the events in his life and some of his for lack of a better word, feats, okay, or we can pin down reasonably well who he was as a person. That's a little bit more difficult because he gets politicized pretty quickly by these 19th century writers who are trying to tell another story, and still manly courage and all this other stuff, um, and sell books. So wouldn't know what he was like as a person in particular, but those events by themselves kind of do demonstrate that he had a lot of guts. He was aggressive. Uh, did what he needed to do, and he was probably the kind of guy he was the kind of guy who'd get people to follow him into the wilderness, where they might be killed at any minute. So that says a lot about him.
Okay, Eric, we always end with this question. How do you think this article helps us understand the Revolutionary Era better?
Part of the reason I like studying the West, and part of what attracted me to this piece was uh, there's no George Washington, there's no Ben Franklin, there's no there's no Nathaniel Greene. The war in the West is, for lack of a better word, fought by the little people. The heroes in the West are regular people. Um, they don't have vast educations. They aren't the most wonderful speakers in the world. So they're never going to sort of get attention the way Franklin or Jefferson. Um, this war's fought by people who live there, and they're just regular people. They're just farmers. Um, Brady's case, a soldier. What I kind of thought and I liked about this particular episode, and what I try to mention in the article, was the experience of warfare, the parallels between the Native Americans and, in this case, the Continentals with Brady. They're small parties. They're operating in unsafe territory. They're on the same trail. They both dress the same. They're both carrying prisoners. They're carrying vulnerable prisoners taken from their homes in Western Ohio, in Brady's case, and in Western Pennsylvania, in the case of the Native Americans. So how they experience the war is very similar, which I always think is interesting because that's not really what's happening in the East.
Eric, as always, thank you again for joining us.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.